Please welcome Congresswoman Jackie Speier in conversation with Geoff Cowan.
Jackie, I can't wait to talk about your wonderful book and your quite remarkable life. But I have to say, as somebody in public life, what could be more gratifying than at the end of an event like this, having a room filled with terrific people. So welcome to all of you, and especially welcome to Jackie Speier.
I want you to look at the gender discrimination in this room, right?
Well, there's a little age too, so we'll be talking about both of them in terms of this fabulous book. But Jackie, you have, and by the way, you've lived such an amazing life, and in this book, which we're going to be talking about, you describe it in such wonderful and candid detail. As I was thinking about a way to start this, I feel like I've known you, and I think other people in the room must too, since 1978. How many of you feel like you were on the tarmac with Jackie Speier in 1978? And Jackie starts with that story. Mm-hmm. And maybe you could read the prologue to the book, which brings us into it, and then we'll talk about how you build on it. And just to preview one thing about this, Jackie's amazing story, you wrote for young women, mm-hmm. Because it's a story of resilience, and hopefully it's a lesson. But let's start.
Okay, we're going to talk really
loud.
We're
supposed to have a mic
right.
Judging this. Anyway, so let's start with Jackie's prologue.
I was dying. It was just a matter of time. Lying behind a wheel of the airplane, bleeding out of the right side of my devastated body, I waited for the rapid shooting to stop, then said my act of contrition, praying by rote for forgiveness. I used what little energy I had left to finish that prayer before the lights went out. But the lights didn't go out, and I slowly began to take stock of my situation. I was 28 years old, and I was about to die. My life would never be the one I had imagined. I'd never get married or become the mother of a boy and girl or leave the world a better place or gently pass when it was my time to go, surrounded by loved ones. Instead, my story was coming to an end on a dusty runway in the humid Guyanese jungle, thousands of miles from home. I don't know if it's possible to articulate how urgently aware you become of the fleeting nature of your existence when you're confronted with its end. I lay there for what felt like an eternity. Somehow, through the encroaching darkness of my final thoughts, I saw my 87-year-old grandma, Emma, the tough, marvelous matriarch of my family. All I could think of was, I'm not going to make Grandma live through my funeral, not if I can help it. If not for my reverence for her, I don't believe I'd be alive today. She encouraged me to summon my will to move. Breathing heavily, I dragged my shattered body away from that wheel. Neither my doctors nor I can explain how I physically managed it, given my state. But I pulled myself up to my feet and stumbled around to take shelter in the baggage compartment. I survived. Survival against unfathomable odds can make every day that follows swell with a renewed sense of purpose, though not immediately and not for everybody. But with the hindsight of 40 years, I see that my baptism by gunfire guided me into the life I was meant to live, one of public service, one that would ignite the courage to make my voice heard, and one that would carry with it a visceral appreciation for each new day. That sentiment was far from my desperate thoughts at the time. Truth be told, it would have been far easier to have closed the box on Guyana long ago, or to have pushed the memory away into the recesses of my mind. What happened in that jungle was a massacre, a nightmare. Though I survived, something within me did die on that airstrip, be it my innocence or my belief in the natural fairness of life. But I can't deny how radically that nightmare molded my perspective and my instincts, and how much it has informed the woman I am today. We don't get to choose our formative moments. Very often, adversity and failure shape us more permanently than fortune and success. That has certainly been the case in my life. The major setbacks I've endured, and there have been many, have actually propelled me onward, each one reminding me how important it is to stand up again, as difficult as it may be, stronger and more steadfast. Pain yields action. It can introduce a fervor to speak out for those whose voices are not heard. Surviving Jonestown crystallized where I needed to focus my energy. It convinced me that I had a purpose. All I had to do was figure out how to fulfill it.
And if that were your last tragedy, then the rest of the book would be building from that. But that wasn't your last tragedy. And one of the things we'll talk about in a minute is how you've learned from and built on and tried to make a difference in the world from each one of the tragedies that followed. But first of all, let's spend a couple of minutes on Jonestown. Could you talk a bit about what Jonestown was as a cult and what you learned from that as a cult, and also what you learned about kind of the government's complicity in it?
So I was the legislative counsel to Congressman Leo Ryan at the time. And he had this concern about what was going on in the People's Temple. It was a large congregation in San Francisco, and about 900 members had left and gone to a commune that they had created in Guyana in what they came to call Jonestown. And right about the time that all of this was happening, a New West article by a reporter named Marshall Kilduff came out. What's interesting is that he was working for the Chronicle. The People's Temple was so wired in San Francisco at the time that all the politicos wouldn't touch it in terms of taking any kind of scrutiny on it. So there was a whisper campaign about physical abuse, sexual abuse, gun running, things like that, but no one was going to touch it because he had 2,000 congregants who at a moment's notice could walk precincts. And Jim Jones was credited for getting George Moscone elected mayor and then helping him avoid the recall. So Marshall Kilduff decided to write this story, and word got out about it, and so the Chronicle said they would not publish it. So he went to this new upstart magazine called New West. The article is published. Meanwhile, Jones gets word of it, brings 900 of his congregation to Jonestown. So it was explosive. It talked about all those terrible things. Many of the members of the congregation were young adult children of constituents of Congressman Ryan, who came to him and said, "We're fearful about our children's well-being. They're not communicating with us." And so he decided to go down and find out for himself. So that was the impetus for the trip. In hindsight, what we learned from it is that our government failed us. It failed us on a local level. Law enforcement at a local level did not respond. And on a federal level, the State Department basically gave us the impression that everything was fine there. They made a trip there arm in arm with Jim Jones, so why would anyone come forward to them? Meanwhile, there had been a couple of defectors who had left the People's Temple, who had been able to tell our embassy officials in Georgetown, Guyana, the capital, about what they were experiencing, and yet our government did nothing.
And so, but Leo Ryan decided he was going to investigate it. And you were an assistant to Leo Ryan, and you guys would go down to investigate it, and you take an NBC News crew with you.
So there was an NBC News crew, there was the Washington Post, there was San Francisco Chronicle and Examiner reporters that were on the trip. And it was after that, the initial visit, Congressman Ryan and I are sitting there passing out letters from family members and meeting with them, trying to find out whether they were happy or not. Meanwhile, Don Harris, who was an NBC reporter, was walking around the perimeter of the pavilion smoking a cigarette, and someone passed him a note. And the note had the names of 2 people that wanted to get out. So at the end of the evening, he brings the note over to Congressman Ryan and myself, and my heart fell.
And Congressman Ryan, by the way, at this moment, has, because he's been fooled, has just given a speech to thunderous applause saying how great things are from what he's seen that day in Jonestown, and then he's given this note.
So then it was clear that at least 2 people wanted to leave. So the next morning, I went to help assist the young woman and Congressman Ryan, the young man. We brought them to the pavilion. Word passed through the commune, and then more and more people wanted to leave. And it got so so tense that I was walking down this little area, and there was a couple with a young child. One was pulling the child one way, the other parent was pulling the child the other way. And I go back to the two attorneys for Jim Jones, who were Charles Gary, if you remember him, and he was big in San Francisco politics, and Mark Lane, if you remember him from the JFK era. And I said to them, there are child custody battles breaking out. You need to do something here. So eventually, the first group of people that wanted to leave are put onto the dump truck. And I'm taking out the first group. Congressman Ryan was staying behind because there was another group that wanted to leave. And then as we were trying to leave, there was this huge noise coming out of the pavilion, and the truck stops, and out walks Congressman Ryan, and his shirt's bloodstained. There had been a knifing attempt on him. So he gets into the cab of the truck. I'm in the bed with all of the defectors. Meanwhile, one of the defectors was bogus, and I could tell. He was wearing a yellow poncho. His name was Larry Layton, and he had just spent 20 minutes, maybe 2 hours before, telling me how great Jonestown was. So it just didn't make sense. So we get to the airstrip. Congressman Ryan is talking to some members of the press. I'm loading passengers onto the plane, and I don't want Larry Layton on the same plane. We now have 2 planes to airlift people out. So I asked one of the reporters to frisk him, and he did, not very effectively, however, because he did have a gun, and he started shooting in the smaller plane. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to us, there's a tractor trailer following behind us with 7 gunmen. And as I was trying to load passengers onto the plane, and my back is to the tractor trailer, they start shooting. And so I turned around and didn't register at first, and then Congressman Ryan was hit, and I started to move towards him. He was hit again, he fell, and then I ran to the other side of the plane and tried to hide behind the wheel and play dead. So I was on my side with my head down, and then they came at point blank range and shot many of us.
And part of the story is, but only one part, is your amazing recovery from that, and a lot of candor about it. One of the things I found amazing was those of us who remember this period, I think most people do, know that in Jonestown everybody committed this mass, quote, suicide. Well, first of all, you don't call it a suicide. But secondly, it had also been, there had been dress rehearsals for this before. Maybe you could describe that for a moment, because that all came as a big surprise to me.
So, and we had been told this by at least one of the defectors, that they did what are called white night trials. And they would, in the middle of the night, the audio would blare, the megaphones would blare and say, come to the pavilion, come to the pavilion. And it was a test. So they would all come, and they would have to drink something. And that was always called the white night trials. And except that after the shooting took place on the airstrip, they did another one, except it was for real this time. And people drank cyanide-laced Kool-Aid, or they injected into children and infants.
Injected. People who didn't do it voluntarily or couldn't were injected.
And there were gunmen surrounding the commune. So it was never a suicide. It was a mass murder.
So this kind of Dianu, if this had been enough for one lifetime of tragedy.
I thought so.
You, having gone through, and you'll all read this story, I hope you will, gone through all the difficulty of recovering physically from this, and not being sure you'll ever be able to find a guy to fall in love with all the physical harm you've experienced, you do. And you fall in love with a wonderful guy, and then you experience another tragedy.
When I was, 14 years after Jonestown, I just sort of had this sense that everyone got their fair dose of grief in life. And I thought mine just came early. And then 14 years later, I'm married, I'm pregnant with our second child, and we're thrilled beyond imagination because I had had two miscarriages, one at 17 weeks before then. So got married, had our first child, became the first legislator to have a baby while in office here in California, and then two miscarriages, and then miraculously I got pregnant at 43 when the fertility specialist had said, based on the age of my eggs and my medical history, I had a 10% chance of getting pregnant with in vitro. So we thought that was not in the offing. And so I got pregnant naturally, and I'm driving to Sacramento one day, and I get a call from my scheduler who said, Steve's been in an accident. And we turned around the car and drove back, and long story short, he was hit by a young driver who had no brakes and ran a red light, and my husband was brain dead. So I had to pick up our 5.5-year-old son from kindergarten and bring him to the hospital to say goodbye to his daddy. And I thought my world was crashing in on me. I didn't think that I could go on.
And then you have another tragedy, which is with the pregnancy, or with a pregnancy.
So it was a very high-risk pregnancy, and I was at bed rest for a good part of it. The beautiful story there is that she was born healthy and is now she's now 25 years old.
Is she the investigative reporter?
Yeah, she's the investigative reporter.
So those of you who want to watch, anybody here from San Francisco, she's just gotten a great job at KGO in San Francisco with an investigative unit, so look for her.
But I did have a high-risk pregnancy that was terminated at 17 weeks. Before then, that was also very hard to deal with. But all of a sudden, after Steve died, I was a widow. I was pregnant with our second child, and I was a single parent. And term limits had taken place in California, and I was about to lose my job.
But I want to talk about your job for a moment, because, I know from my wife, Eileen Adams, whose job included victims of crime.
There's Eileen. Stand up, Eileen Adams. Former Secretary of
State and Consumer Services, but it included Victims Office. She had headed the Victims Crime Office in the federal government. And the 9/11 victims were coming, people were coming here. And so the 9/11 victims' families and so forth came to, Eileen was responsible for taking care of them. And there was only one state legislator they wanted to meet. And that was somebody who had been a victim herself and had become a victims champion, and that was Jackie Speier. I apologize. I thought they controlled these mics. The 9/11 victims only had one state legislator they wanted to meet. And that was a state legislator who had herself been a victim, and that was Jackie Speier. But Jackie, one thing that is so powerful to me from the story, and there are many other things you talk about that are candid, and by the way, Jackie does find love and is married again. I don't know if your husband is here.
No, he's not, but my sister-in-law, his sister is here.
Okay, where's she? Let's get sister-in-law waving in the back. So
actually, can I just announce that they're celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary today.
So happy anniversary to all of you. But Jackie, one thing that fascinates me in reading this book is how you have all of these terrible things that happen to you, and it's, you're seeing it now as a Netflix series. If there's anybody here from Netflix or from a Netflix family or something, Netflix series to come. But the amazing thing is, almost every one of these things you turn into a legislative solution. And I think there's a lesson in that more broadly, but maybe you could talk about a little bit how you deal with these tragedies. And one of the most amazing scenes in the book to me is when you were talking about gun control. Maybe you could describe that scene.
So I was carrying the assault weapon ban on the assembly side. It was a Senate bill by then Senator David Roberti, and he asked me to be the what they call jockey on the assembly floor. So I'm actually presenting the bill on the assembly floor, and one of my colleagues throws up his mic and says, "Will the gentlelady yield?" And I says, "Yes." And so he stands up and he says, "Miss Speier, have you ever shot an assault weapon?" And then he says it again. "Have you ever shot an assault weapon?" And I thought to myself, if you're stupid enough to ask me this question, I'm going to give it right back to you. And I said, "No, Assemblyman, but let me ask you a question. Have you ever been shot by an assault weapon?"
And something like that.
And let me,
So
can I
sorry,
just
please.
finish?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
He sits down. His Republican colleagues say, "Good job, Ted." You know, remember Ted Baxter? And the bill flies off the assembly floor and is signed into law by Republican Governor Pete Wilson.
Wow. Wow.
Well, how times have changed, though, really.
Yeah. How they have. But you did this too in terms of other issues, where you took the tragedy, including what happened to your husband, and turned it into something positive for the people of California, and then people of the United States. Could you describe that?
So when my husband was killed in that automobile accident, the young driver had no insurance. No auto insurance, and so there was no way to be compensated. And I thought to myself, what if I didn't have the resources to pay for his funeral? How about people that don't have any money and have this kind of tragedy happen to them? So I carried a bill in the state legislature that required proof of auto insurance at time of registration and a low-cost auto insurance policy for those of low income, so that at the very least everyone would be covered for $15,000 per person or $30,000 per incident. And so that was one thing I did. One of the stories I didn't tell is that we also adopted a baby at one point after I had the 2 miscarriages, and then the birth mother took the baby back.
Well, so let's start with this. So the birth mother wants to. She doesn't want to raise the baby. So at first she arranges for you to take over, to be responsible for the baby. So it's at her wish that you do it, or so you believe.
Right.
And then what happens?
And then 10 days later, my husband calls and says the birth mother wants to take the baby back.
And you've now bonded with this baby.
Right. So as a result of that experience, and that was only 10 days. Imagine, in California at the time it was 6 months. So I carried the legislation to reduce it to 3 months.
So I think there's something in this, and I think we were talking about this a little before when Eileen's worked with victims so much. So many victims have turned their tragedy, Mothers Against Drunk Driving being one that always comes to my mind. But so many people, you could think your life is over with the tragedy, but you can also turn to something positive. And Jackie, you've done that, and you've worked with people who do it.
I think that's, how do you go on after you've had something so painful happen to you? I will say there were times when I did not want to get out of bed after my husband was killed. And I actually gave myself permission to stay in bed. I just promised myself I'd get up the next day, and then I would, and then things would get better. But it is, I see it with the Newtown families. They've lost their babies, and their whole goal in life is to make sure it doesn't happen to others. So there's a great humanity in that, I think.
And I think this is part of one of many lessons in this book, but I think an important lesson for all of us is, live the tragedy, but then try to turn to something positive. And you've done this so many times in so many ways in your own life. Well, I don't consider term limits a tragedy, but then...
It was for me. 2 times over, I might add.
Right. So from the legislature to the state senate to all of a sudden the federal government. And as most of you know, Jackie's right now playing a very important role today in the federal government as a member of Congress. And maybe, Jackie, you could describe a little bit the transition to getting there, and then talk a bit about some of the issues we're facing today. And then we're going to also open this up for questions, and I'm sure that a lot of people will have questions here.
So I had no intentions of ever going back to Washington after I left. It was a place that I just never wanted to revisit. And yet, I always think that there's a plan for each of us in our lives. We oftentimes aren't aware of it, until we have some hindsight. So there was a plan for me to go back to Washington, and Congressman Tom Lantos announced that he wasn't running for re-election again, and people urged me to run, so I did, and then the following month he died of esophageal cancer. So in a short span of 3 months, I was walking onto the House floor to be sworn in the very same congressional seat that Congressman Ryan had held so many years before. And I had run for his congressional seat after Guyana because I wanted to kind of not be remembered as a survivor of Jonestown. I didn't want that
Didn't want to be a victim.
Yes, didn't want to be a victim. So I did it for two reasons: to continue his legacy and for psychological and emotional support, because I wanted to get to start thinking about something other than these wounds that I was healing from. And so I lost that election and had vowed never to ever go back. So I'm walking onto the House floor, and I have the record in Congress of the length of time from the first time you run to the second time that you run and get elected. It was 29 years. So it was, obviously a very emotional moment. And I like to think that I brought to my work a lot of the lessons I learned from Congressman Ryan. He was an investigative, experiential legislator. When he was in the state legislature, he spent days as a substitute teacher in Watts after the riots because of his teaching experience. He spent a week at Folsom Prison because he was doing a review of criminal justice system. So I've taken that experience as much as I can and learned from it.
And even the Jonestown thing, he was being told, don't go to Jonestown. There's nothing there to see. It looked like for a while he wasn't even going to get a plane. The government wasn't going to give him a plane to go to Jonestown. He said, no, I've heard these stories. I've got to go. But that took a lot of courage and a lot of gumption and the ability to sort of buck the system to do it.
So I take my role very seriously in terms of trying to experience what those I represent experience. I've spent a night in a homeless shelter in my district. And one of the takeaways from that experience was listening to a veteran who said to me, he had just gotten out of a drug rehab program in the Veterans Administration. He had had a 6-figure job at a tech company, and then he spiraled out of control. And he looked me in the eyes and he says, "You have no idea what my country forced me to do in Iraq." So it helped me kind of measure the lives of homeless people. I've taken what's called the food stamp challenge. People on food stamps have to live on $4.50 a day. I did it for 5 days. I spent every waking moment thinking about food. And I survived on tuna and lettuce and tomatoes and instant coffee that I had to buy at the dollar store. It's an interesting experience. You should try it.
It's interesting theory, and that has its own name. Experiential. What are you calling that kind
Experiential legislating is what I call it.
Experiential legislating. Interesting concept, and something we can all learn from. You don't just learn from books, though. That's hugely important. You don't just learn from testimony. You learn from your own experience. And of course, we've talked about you learn through your own personal tragedies. But you're saying even people who don't go through those things, God forbid, can learn from experiences that they take on themselves. But you're also a member of the Intelligence Committee. And I think everybody today is thinking about those issues, and maybe you could share with us for a moment some insights from that.
So the Intelligence Committee has the oversight responsibility over all of our intelligence communities, so there's 17 agencies. And it's the underbelly of our government. It's the very important work that's done to keep us safe, to assess our friends and foes, And it also requires legislative leadership to make sure we don't engage in torture conduct, for instance, or we don't try to impact elections in other countries, things like that. So it's been a very profound experience to recognize how gifted and how others-centered all of the people who work in that part of our government. And yet we have a whistleblower right now who is from the intelligence community, who is being horribly maligned because he was trying to put his country first. So it's very interesting work, but it does underscore how we have lots of foes around the world, even in places you would never think.
And your committee, it's not only about impeachment, it's about a lot of other crucial issues. But maybe before I turn this to some questions, since you've raised the issue of whistleblowers, you could talk about why that matters. Why is it important that we protect whistleblowers, leaving aside this situation of the individual who's in this situation, the whistleblower, who, by the way, yesterday, a United States senator left the Senate hearing and publicly named the person he believes to be this whistleblower who is protected by federal law. But maybe you could talk about why that's important.
So particularly in the intelligence community, there is a requirement in the law that if you come forward as an intelligence officer to complain about something that's going on in our government, and if the Inspector General determines it to be both credible and urgent, you are protected if you want to retain your anonymity. And that's why it's been so important to do that. Whistleblowers generally in our government should be heralded as guardians of our government because they root out waste, fraud, and abuse. And $50–60 billion has been restored because it's been identified by whistleblowers from time to time. I was honoring one of them recently. Actually, there were two of them at an event. And they were working at a VA hospital, and they were complaining about the sterilization of equipment. And they were ignored, so they filed a complaint. They were then fired. And come to find out, not only were they accurate, but it affected the lives of a number of veterans. So it's not... It wouldn't be inappropriate to say sometimes whistleblowers actually save lives, let alone protect us from waste, fraud, and abuse. So it is very important, and they should have the right to remain anonymous. And there's huge examples of reprisals that they experience as a result of coming forward.
And actually, I think it's fair to say that one of the big champions of whistleblower protection until most recently was Mike Pence. Because Mike Pence actually, he believed strongly in the press's right to have this information and so forth. Comes as a little bit of surprise to some people to realize it. But it's not where he is today.
Senator Grassley is as well, and
Yeah.
I'm sure he would be very critical of
The False
anyone
Claims Act, which is incredibly important and requires that kind of integrity, has been Grassley's baby. So, there are plenty of people on both sides of the aisle who, at least at a time a few weeks ago, stood for those principles. Jackie, I want people to know you live here and you have a home here in this region. So after we break and so forth, in future times, they'll get to know you here. Before we turn to questions, and I do want to open up for questions, I'm sure there'll be plenty. I want you to talk a little bit again about why you wrote this book, who you hope to reach with it, and who you hope anybody who buys the book will give their copy to.
So I wrote the book with, first of all, it's not a political book. It's a very personal book. And as I said to Jeff a little bit, there's a rawness to it because I was not going to spin anything. I wanted it to be as genuine as possible. And I really wrote it for young women. interestingly enough, they're not necessarily the ones buying it, but I wrote it for young women so that they would realize that they can overcome anything. That all the things that have happened to me have, in many respects, made me stronger. And we have the resilience internally to overcome so very much. If someone had told me that I would be shot in Guyana, what would my reaction be? I says, I would probably turn into a fetal position and never, never move again. But you'd be surprised at what you have internally. The other thing that was a surprise to me, my parents, I was born into a very blue-collar family. And there's some pretty funny stories about what my mother had us do from time to make a few extra dimes. But it was, the one thing they certainly wanted for me was for me to achieve my goals in life. So, I go to college, first in my family to go to college, then to law school, and I thought I was pretty smart. And that I, had learned some things from my parents, but that truly I was, up here. And then I wrote the book and I realized how much I was just part and parcel of my family. So in the acknowledgments, the very first thing I do is talk about how grateful I was to my parents for all that they had provided for me, because I was humbled by the fact that I was very much a part of who they are and were. And I encourage each of you to write your stories. Seriously. I mean, I wrote this for young people. I also wrote it for my kids. And I ended up voicing the Audible book because I want them to have my voice so they remember years after I'm gone.
So lesson to the group, write an Audible book. And by the way, today we're in a time you can do it one way or another. You can always leave a wonderful memoir for your grandchildren, whether it's published officially or not. Let me get some questions, and I'll try to repeat them because it'll be hard to hear it, and I'll try to project myself, please.
I just back to the whistleblower. Are there consequences to that senator for?
Will there be consequences? It was Rand Paul, I believe. Will there be any consequences for Rand Paul having gone to publicly name the whistleblower?
So I'm not prepared to say whoever he named is the person. So there may not be a consequence for him right now. One of the things we always learn when we have experiences like this is that our laws are imperfect, and that we have to put more guardrails in place to make sure that there is the appropriate penalty for taking action that violates the law. Lots of times you can take actions that you know are wrong and not face much of a penalty, or see that as a cost of doing business, and so you continue to conduct yourself in that way. So that clearly is an area that we're going to have to look at.
Yes, back here.
One of the things I think people worry about in terms of whistleblowers is that a whistleblower could say something that wasn't true or that was only partly true. So I'm assuming that when somebody comes to you with a whistleblower that's as important as this one, that you all investigated right to the
So I'm going to repeat this. Question is, how do you make sure that when a whistleblower comes to you, that what they're saying is accurate?
So there's a whole investigation that goes on, and whistleblower complaints that turn out to be inaccurate, of course, don't move forward. But when whistleblower complaints are deemed to be accurate, move forward, and there's still reprisals for the individual who has brought the complaint, there's something wrong in the system. And unfortunately, the reprisal, they may be reinstated, but oftentimes the person who is responsible for the reprisals' head doesn't roll, and probably should.
It's a good question. There are consequences. If a whistleblower is lying, the consequences for the whistleblower are what?
So if the whistleblower is lying, they can be removed. I mean, there's such a downside risk today to become a whistleblower, and there's such a chilling effect now that's been created that we've actually seen a decline in legitimate whistleblower complaints because you become the subject of criticism. Your life can be threatened. There's so many things that can happen as a result of coming forward. And you can lose your job.
There's a question back here. Yeah. And could you scream it to the front? Thanks.
So we live in Redwood Shores, so thanks for being our representative. Are you doing anything new on the privacy side, which you used to be very active in?
What is Jackie Speier doing about privacy issues?
So when I was in the state legislature, I carried the legislation on financial privacy, so that you would have control over your financial information. That was back in 2002, 3, and it's kind of almost a joke now because everything about us is known. You know, the legislation that's been passed by the European Union is very robust. It's been somewhat copied by this new law that just went into effect here in California that we're looking at on a federal level that would place you as an individual in control of your information, so that if you don't want to be tracked online, you won't be. And what we don't know, frankly, most of the time, is that we are being tracked on virtually every search that we do. I mean, I just changed to DuckDuckGo for that reason, so that I will have the ability to search without someone watching my every move. But every time I go to Macy's, it seems like the next day I have that same item coming up that I just looked at that they still want me to buy. So
You're tying together the topic of whistleblowers and privacy. Some of you may know that Cambridge Analytica was kind of exposed by somebody named Brittany Kaiser. A few of you may have seen a movie. You can see it on Netflix, very interesting, called The Great Hack. And her cause now is called Own Your Own Data, because what she's saying is Macy's or others, your data is being sold to Macy's, but you're not profiting from it. Right. Is that a part of where you're going with this? So
here in California, I mean, the legislation that I carried in California, before this super legislation that just passed, I mean, you had a Safeway card. They were tracking your information. Well, we shut that down. That was a bill I carried. And then your financial information, you had the opportunity to opt out of having that information shared. That was the law. Now we have a superimposed law here in California. There's a GDPR that is this law in Europe that actually fines those who violate your privacy by fining that particular company, and that's where Google got fined, I don't know, $5 billion if I I might be wrong on the actual amount. So the question is how serious we're going to take it here in the United States. I mean, I don't think Facebook can say it's just a platform. And, you know, its whole business plan is about finding out as much as they can about us and then sending ads to us. Now, they don't share their information with anyone else, but indeed, with a few clicks, you can find out a whole lot about each and every one of us.
It's kind of a frightening world that we're all entering, and I guess we're hoping the legislature will find a solution that isn't even worse than the situation without the legislation. Is there one more or two more questions? Please, standing up was a good idea, if you could.
First of all, thank you as a leader for taking such good care of our daughter in Washington.
Oh,
as you did.
thank you.
Our daughter doesn't live in Washington or as far as leadership is concerned, how do you think women would rule better, if you will? Just excuse me, but if to lead our country, what characteristics, how do women lead?
So in 53 seconds, I'm going to tell you, women lead differently than men. Part of it is the fact that women see in politics it more of a game, and it's more of a political battle that's being played out. It's almost like a game of war. Women tend to look at it as a policy opportunity. So I think that you would see more consensus building going on, an effort to get to a solution. You know, Janet Rankin was the first woman to serve in Congress. She voted against World War I and lost her seat. She was reelected some years later and then voted against World War II and lost her seat. I do think that women tend to be better peacemakers, and I think we need that desperately right now in the country.
If you want to know more about Jackie Speier, not only is her book for sale, I think it's around for free too. She's going to be signing it outside. Lunch, I think, is going to be served right after this session. Thank you all for being part of another great Writers Festival.